May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Inside Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters, the morning clock struck 800 hours as Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton stood before his commander with a folder containing intelligence so exact it seemed impossible. "The Japanese are coming to Midway," he said. "They'll approach from the northwest on bearing 325 degrees, spotted about 175 miles from the island. The attack will begin at 0700 hours on June 4th. Nimitz stared calmly, asking, "You're telling me you know exactly where Yamamoto will be, when he'll arrive, and what he plans to do?" Layton nodded. "Yes, sir. We can read every order, every report, everything." The room went silent. In that moment, Nimitz realized America possessed something more powerful than any battleship: knowledge of Japan's deepest secrets. This was the culmination of 2 decades of quiet work, of brilliant mathematics and patient analysis that began long before the war. In the early 1920s, a young naval officer named Lawrence Safford foresaw that future wars would be fought not just with guns and ships, but with information. In 1924, he established the Navy's first code-breaking unit, a few officers armed with pencils, not weapons, deciphering foreign communications. Safford recruited linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators who could pluck faint signals from the air. Among them was a gifted young man named Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort joined the Navy in 1918, lying about his age to enlist during World War I. His talent for puzzles and languages soon brought him to the Code and Signal section in Washington. In 1929, he was sent to Tokyo to study Japanese. For 3 years, he immersed himself in the language, culture, and mindset of Japan's military. There he met another officer, Edwin Layton. The two became close friends, both convinced that understanding Japan's thinking would one day be vital to America's survival. Their foresight proved prophetic. On June 1, 1939, the Japanese introduced their most advanced naval code, designated JN-25. It used a 2-layer encryption system, a codebook of 33,000 5-digit numbers representing words or phrases, further obscured by adding random 5-digit additives from a separate book. It was a cipher so complex that to decode even one message required stripping away the additive and matching thousands of possible number combinations. By 1940, American and British cryptanalysts had identified about 10% of the code, just enough to glimpse its structure. Then, in December of that year, Japan replaced the entire codebook with JN-25B, forcing the Americans to start from scratch. Slowly, through guesswork and mathematics, they began piecing it together again. By late 1941, they were making real progress until December 4th, just 3 days before Pearl Harbor, when Japan changed its additive tables. For weeks, American cryptanalysts were blind. When Japanese bombers struck Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, the men of America's code-breaking service felt they had failed personally. They'd been close, so close to seeing it coming. Among them was Rochefort, who had just taken command of Station HYPO in the basement of the 14th Naval District building in Pearl Harbor. That unremarkable concrete structure would soon become one of the most important rooms in the Pacific War. Station HYPO was 60 feet long, windowless, humming with fluorescent lights and the constant clatter of IBM tabulating machines. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Rochefort, eccentric but brilliant, often worked for 72 hours straight in a smoking jacket and slippers. Around him were men whose names history almost forgot. Thomas Dyer, a cryptanalytic genius. Alva Laswell, fluent in Japanese military phrasing. Ham Wright, a tireless codebreaker. Joseph Finnegan, a mathematician who found patterns in chaos. And dozens of enlisted sailors, many of them former band musicians from the sunken battleship USS California, whose knack for reading sheet music translated into spotting rhythmic patterns in strings of numbers. The work was brutal. Intercepted Japanese messages arrived as endless strings of 5-digit groups. Each had to be stripped of additives, cross-referenced, and catalogued. Every unknown pattern went on an index card, organized by frequency, sender, and context. The IBM machines, normally used for payroll accounting, were adapted to sort and count code groups by the thousands. Gradually, the chaos began to make sense. By February 1942, Station HYPO could read about 1 word in 5, just enough to grasp intent. They could see troop movements, ship names, and operation patterns. In April, Joseph Finnegan cracked the Japanese date-time encryption system, allowing HYPO to read when operations were planned. It was a breakthrough that would soon decide the fate of the Pacific. That same month, the analysts began noticing increased radio chatter about a place designated AF. The coded references mentioned air units, supply ships, and preparations for invasion. What was AF? Washington analysts guessed it might be Alaska's Aleutian Islands, or perhaps Port Moresby in New Guinea. But Rochefort's team was convinced it meant Midway Atoll, a tiny U.S. outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Conviction wasn't enough. Admiral Nimitz needed proof before risking his few remaining carriers. Then, one of Rochefort's officers, Captain Jasper Holmes, proposed a simple but ingenious test. Midway would transmit an uncoded radio message claiming its water distillation plant had broken down and it was short on fresh water. If Japan's spies were monitoring American transmissions, and if AF was indeed Midway, they'd soon mention the water shortage in their own encrypted traffic. Nimitz approved. On May 20th, Midway sent the fake distress call. 2 days later, HYPO intercepted a Japanese intelligence report noting that AF is short of water. That was the proof. AF was Midway. Rochefort immediately relayed the discovery to Layton, who briefed Nimitz. The admiral now knew precisely where Japan would strike, but he needed more. When, and with what forces? Over the next days, HYPO's team tore into every intercepted message. Finnegan focused on decoding date-time groups. On May 25th, he made a major breakthrough, deducing the Japanese system for encrypting operation schedules. The result was astonishing. The Japanese strike on Midway would begin on June 4th, at 0700 hours from the northwest. Now Nimitz could act. He ordered his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, to position northwest of Midway to ambush the enemy. The Yorktown, still damaged from the Coral Sea, had been declared out of action for 3 months. Nimitz gave the shipyard 3 days. 1,400 workers labored around the clock, cutting, welding, patching holes, using so much electricity that Oahu's power grid flickered under rolling blackouts. 72 hours later, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor, repair crews still aboard, heading into battle. On June 3rd, U.S. patrol planes spotted Japanese ships approaching from the west. At dawn the next day, radar operators on Midway detected aircraft incoming from the northwest, exactly as predicted. At 0702 hours, Japanese bombers struck the island, missing the American carriers, which lay hidden to the northeast. When Nimitz received the first reports, he told Layton, "You were off by only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles." The Battle of Midway raged from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. American dive bombers found and destroyed 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, in the space of minutes. Later that day, they sank the 4th, Hiryu. In exchange for the loss of Yorktown and 1 destroyer, the United States Navy annihilated Japan's elite carrier force. 4 carriers, 250 aircraft, and 3,500 of Japan's most experienced sailors and pilots were gone. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted forever. But the victory at Midway was only the beginning. Station HYPO continued breaking JN-25 for the rest of the war. The Japanese never realized their code was compromised. even after America began anticipating their every move. When their ships sailed, U.S. submarines waited. When their planes redeployed, U.S. bombers were ready. One of the most dramatic examples came in April 1943, when American cryptanalysts intercepted a message detailing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's inspection flight across the Solomon Islands. It contained his exact route and schedule. On April 18th, a squadron of P-38 Lightnings flew 500 miles from Guadalcanal, intercepted Yamamoto's transport, and shot it down. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead, because the U.S. could read Japan's most secret communications. The operation was called Vengeance, and it proved the immense power of information. Ironically, this intelligence triumph nearly unraveled after Midway. On June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a story titled "Navy Had Word of Jap Plan to Strike at Sea," written by reporter Stanley Johnston, who had seen classified dispatches. The article implied the U.S. knew Japan's battle plan in advance. President Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox were furious. They pushed for prosecution under the Espionage Act, but the grand jury refused to indict. By sheer luck, Japan never noticed or never understood the article's implications. The secret stayed safe. Station HYPO kept working in silence, its operators still buried in that Pearl Harbor basement, decoding messages that would guide the Pacific War to its end. The men who broke JN-25 rarely saw sunlight. They weren't celebrated like fighter pilots or battleship captains, yet their contribution changed history. They didn't just save ships, they saved nations. The victory at Midway wasn't won by guns or planes alone, but by intelligence, by the quiet brilliance of people who turned strings of numbers into the knowledge that reshaped the Pacific. And when Admiral Nimitz later reflected on the battle that changed the course of World War II, he credited not luck, but those unseen heroes who, with pencils, punch cards, and endless determination, ensured that when the enemy came to Midway, America was already waiting.